The New World, 1763. A momentous time. The long years of the French and Indian War exist only as memories of battles and skirmishes, like this one in Pennsylvania 8 years earlier. Now the land is finally at peace. The French armies are gone now. The Indians pushed back from the slender line of settlements hugging the Atlantic coast. From Hudson Bay to Florida, the British flag flies unchallenged. England reigns supreme. Peace, however, can sometimes be deceptive. This particular one carries with it seeds of a war that will change the course of world history. His Majesty George III, King of Great Britain, shown here with his queen and their children, ruled over one of the mightiest empires the world has known. In America, though each colony distrusted the others, they all remained loyal to the king. Great Britain had poured out its treasure for those far-flung possessions. Now the debts of war must be paid, the treasury refilled. The colonies had proved their worth. From ports such as Charleston, South Carolina, ships sailed for England with raw materials, then returned with finished goods for sale in America. The colonies also supported the crown with their taxes. Many of them collected here at the London Customs House in the form of duties on certain imported goods. But over the years, the system for collecting those taxes had grown unwieldy. Smugglers brought the colonies shiploads of untaxed luxuries from Europe and elsewhere. So King George set his government to work building a tax system for the 1.5 million American colonists, one that would make them more self-supporting and help pay for their defense. Britain's first efforts to end smuggling and collect taxes caused only a mild outcry. Its next move elicited a more spirited response. A new tax required stamps like these on printed materials such as legal documents, advertisements, newspapers, even playing cards. Though the bill managed to offend almost everyone and was met with loud and widespread opposition, Parliament adopted it in 1765. One newspaper in Pennsylvania stopped publication to avoid paying the tax. In its last issue, it printed this grim parody of the king's stamps. In the Virginia legislature at Williamsburg, Patrick Henry suggested that George III might die as a murdered tyrant. "If this be treason, make the most of it," he was reported to have replied when other members cried out in horror. But they passed 4 of his resolutions condemning the Stamp Act, and other colonial legislatures adopted similar measures. Patriots throughout the colonies held meetings like this one in Boston to protest the tax. Calling themselves Sons of Liberty, some of them threatened the stamp distributors. Mobs rioted in the streets. Only a year after passage of the act, Parliament repealed it. In this English cartoon, a man in a funeral procession carries a tiny casket that symbolizes the repealed Stamp Act, now dead. Ignoring signs of growing bitterness, another tax on a few goods, including tea. Large numbers of the colonists stopped buying British manufactures. And in 1770, Parliament repealed the tax on all items except tea. Throughout the colonies, tempers became further inflamed that year when pictures like this one began circulating. Engraved by a Boston silversmith named Paul Revere, it depicted the slaughter of innocent civilians by British troops, the Boston Massacre. However, eyewitnesses later swore that the soldiers fired in self-defense. As for tea, colonists either smuggled it or used substitutes. In 1772, a group of Rhode Island smugglers boarded a revenue vessel patrolling coastal waters. They overpowered the crew, wounded the captain who had tried to enforce the laws against smuggling and set fire to his ship. Although a high reward was offered, no one would identify the culprits to British authorities. But in spite of incidents like these, tensions may well have eased had not the issue been resurrected in 1773, Frederick Lord North, King George's prime minister. The colonists, he reasoned, would buy taxed tea if they could get it cheaper than the smuggled variety. So he removed an import duty, but left the tax on the tea and sent it on its way. But the colonies would not be bought off so easily. By now, they were just as determined to control their own affairs as Parliament was to rule them, though they technically belonged to the Crown. A mob in Boston tarred and feathered a customs officer, threatened him with hanging, and forced huge quantities of tea down his throat. In January 1774, high British officials called Benjamin Franklin, in London as agent for Massachusetts, before them. Angered by inflammatory propaganda circulating in the colonies, they heaped insults on this distinguished American subject. That same month, word reached Parliament that a band of those seditious Sons of Liberty, masquerading as Indians, had boarded 3 British vessels moored in Boston Harbor and had dumped overboard 342 chests of tea. Soon, England would learn of similar acts here at Yorktown, as well as Charleston, New York, and Annapolis. Parliament moved swiftly. Singling out Massachusetts as an example to the rest, it passed a series of stringent measures that turned Boston into an occupied fortress until the tea damages were repaid. A fleet blockaded the city's port. British troops here arriving in Boston were authorized to take over private homes at will, and British officials accused of crimes were not to stand trial in the colonies, but be sent to England. Massachusetts stood defiant, and the other colonies moved to its support. In this cartoon, printed in England in 1774, boatmen representing the other colonies deliver fish to imprisoned Bostonians. For if the citizens of Boston could lose their rights so quickly, no citizen was safe. So calls went out for a meeting of the colonies. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall on September 5, 1774. Here, the delegates listed their grievances and pledged to restrict trade with Britain until redress was made. Hopeful that compromise would be reached, they adjourned. In London, King George made a stinging reply. The New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. Ensuing events would speed the approach of war. This fateful skirmish at Lexington. Minutemen defending the bridge at Concord. Once peaceful towns and villages taking up arms as the news of the fighting spread. Armed colonials poised on the heights above Boston, ready to wrench it back from its occupying forces. Clearly, Britain did not intend to back down. The situation was critical. And so again, delegates from across the land met in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress convened on May 10, 1775, here in the State House, now known as Independence Hall. It was a gathering of the keenest minds in the colonies, representing a cross-section of opinion. John Adams of Massachusetts, stocky, strong-minded, burning with a zeal that made him prod and poke, and if necessary, browbeat his colleagues into action. His kinsman, Samuel Adams, who possessed the fiery temperament of a true revolutionary and incendiary, a man with a single burning obsession, liberty. Slender John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, an early voice against oppression. Throughout the debates to come, Dickinson led the faction of moderation and reconciliation. His fellow Pennsylvanian, Benjamin Franklin, respected man of science and statesman, whose long silence aroused distrust until he revealed his American sympathies. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, diffident, quiet, Of him, John Adams remarked, "I never heard him utter 3 sentences together." But Jefferson's pen revealed his genius. These were just a few of the delegates sitting in this room. Though some already talked of independence, most longed for a peaceable solution. And while they created an army, they composed a plea for the king's intercession and sent it off in July 1775. In October, this answer finally arrived. The king had rejected their plea. Peace was fluttering out of reach. In New York City, Patriot Marinus Willett halted a British regiment embarking for Boston. With the help of other Sons of Liberty, he seized cartloads of spare muskets that would arm New York's first colonial troops. 11 days later, on June 17, 1775, British forces defeated the Americans here in the Battle of Bunker Hill. More fighting raged in Canada. By February 1776, King George had pronounced the American actions treason and rebellion. Rumors of his Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers like these, reached America. To the delegates in Philadelphia, it was now obvious. Great Britain had charted a course for war. The Congress acted accordingly. Ceasing all trade with Britain, it flung open America's ports to all the world and dispatched an envoy to France to plead for aid. On June 7, 1776, Virginia's Richard Henry Lee stood before the assembled delegates and offered a bold proposal. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. After 2 days of debate, Congress decided to postpone a final decision. However, they appointed a 5-man committee that included young Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin to prepare a statement should the resolution pass. Finally, on July 2nd, 1776, Lee's motion carried. It was left now to justify to the world America's commitment to independence and to a war. Almost totally drafted by Jefferson, who used this writing box, the document was an extraordinary one. Although specific in its indictments of the king, the Declaration of Independence was universal in its affirmation of the dignity of man. Its doctrine of natural rights would become a creed for all the world's oppressed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, it began, that all men are created equal. Jefferson presented it to John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress. For 2 days, the delegates revised and refined it. Then, on July 4th, 1776, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. The news was greeted by tumult and cannon fire. Patriots raised liberty poles like this one in celebration, and bells rang night and day across the land. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress got on with the bitter business of war.